you, Ellen. Hi, everyone. Welcome. As was said, my name is Shauna Egan, and I'm from Carroll Community College. And this is Flexible Grouping Strategies for Online and In-Person Instruction. So I am currently the instructional specialist at Carroll Community College, but I previously worked as an ABE instructor and also as a special educator in grades K through 6. Just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We did the introduction. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the benefits of using groups in instruction, methods for identifying which students would fit into which group, methods for identifying the content that you are planning to cover and review in groups, ways to communicate the structure and the class routine of the groups and rotations to your students. I know everyone is working in different situations, so there's some adaptations for online or in-person instruction, and a quick top 5 list of 5 quick tips to get started. We are a little tight on time, and we do have one interactive activity, so if there is time at the end, we can do a little bit of a question and answer, but if we don't get to that, I also will provide my contact information, so please reach out with any and all questions. So I have been using groups in my instruction even prior to coming to the adult education world. And then once I became an ABE instructor, I immediately saw that I needed to also incorporate that into my class instruction. I noticed once I incorporated it into class instruction, a lot of benefits for my students. Many of my classes were multi-level, as I'm sure that some of you also have. So using groups in instruction allows for you to really target those specific gaps or those different levels of students that you're working with. You're also working with students at a level where they feel comfortable. So giving them multiple opportunities to practice a skill is going to build their confidence and make them more independent with it. As the teacher, working with students in small groups gives you more opportunities to give them very specific feedback, which I think also in turn builds that relationship between the teacher and the student. There's an increased sense of community. If students get comfortable working in small groups, sometimes they're more likely to participate and start conversations with each other. I know there's a difference in the environment when I'm in a Zoom call of 200 people versus when I'm in a much smaller group. And I think the students feel that as well. It elicits collaboration. So depending on the task, you can assign group or paired projects for the students to work on. And also just the fact of working together in small groups kind of elicits that collaborative spirit. In my groupings, I usually build a portion of the time that is independent work or partner work, and having a portion of the time where they are asked to complete a task without direct access to the teacher or without direct modeling and guidance kind of builds that independence that we're trying to foster for students as they go on to college classes or into the workforce. And additionally, I know there's been times that I've had to provide technology assistance to one student or a couple of students, or as we're moving into different types of assessments, there's been times that I've had to pull one student aside for targeted reading assessment, for example, and having groups with an independent component built in kind of allows the teacher more flexibility for that assessment or for that one-on-one troubleshooting. A big question that comes up when you're thinking about using groups is the question of using homogeneous groups or heterogeneous groups. So this chart kind of just explains briefly some of the differences between them. If you're interested in more information, the article at the bottom that's cited is really helpful in kind of explaining an overview of the differences. But to kind of break it down, heterogeneous groups is when you're working with students of mixed levels or mixed topics that they need to work on. Some of the benefits are that students, the higher level students, can learn and really solidify their understanding of the content by breaking it down and teaching it to others. And it's also shown to be the most effective type of grouping with struggling students. Some of the disadvantages are that if you have students at a higher level or students that are very focused on completing the task, sometimes us as teachers, we might say, okay, this student will help keep the rest of the group focused and make sure that they stay working on the task at hand. But if that's always the case, sometimes that can be a little draining on those students that are constantly kind of moving everyone along. Also, sometimes those higher level students may not be extremely challenged because they're kind of breaking down concepts that they have a good understanding of. So again, it just depends on the task and what you're considering, but that's just something to think of. If you are working with a multi-level class, it can also be a little bit more difficult to target specific content or gaps. Moving on to homogeneous groups, that's same level groupings. You can target specific content needs at the student's level, which can be really helpful if you have specific math skills or time periods when the student missed formal education that they really need direct instruction in those skills. Students in the middle of the class are shown to really benefit from homogeneous grouping. But there's several important considerations to think of. It's important to make these groups flexible and not fixed. It can be sometimes at the beginning of the session, you create the groups, and it can be you want to stay with those groups, but it's important to remember that all students learn at different rates. So you want to reassess and reevaluate and just think about whether any students would need to move to another group to make it more appropriate for them. Another concern that you can witness from time to time is that students can be discouraged if they perceive that they're in a lower level group. So a couple of things to kind of think of with that is just try to build the class community that everyone needs to work on different topics and that students get what they need to make progress and help them reach their goals. And also just to be flexible and reassess your groups often so that it's not setting a one-time group that's thought of in the beginning of the session. Reflecting on it and thinking about what the students need can be helpful in that regard. Some things to think about when considering if you want to put students into heterogeneous or homogeneous groups are to consider the purpose. Is it a community building exercise? Is it very content specific? Are you going to be using different reading leveled text that students would need to be able to access? So just consider the task and the purpose of the task. Consider your students and their needs. Include variety. It's always helpful to kind of mix things up and try new things and see what your students respond to. What works for one group of students may not work as well for the next. So mixing it up and really seeing what your students are engaged with is going to be helpful. And also reevaluating your groups often. And we're going to talk about several different ways to do that in the coming slides. So there are several different methods of identifying group members. The first thing that you can do is use assessment data, and that can either be from standardized tests or from classroom pre-tests, post-tests, projects, rubrics. Anything like that could be used to develop your assessment data. When I would teach ABE classes, I would look at the CASAS results that I would receive in the beginning of the session. And then I would break students into general groups from that data. But then as I learned more about the students and became more familiar with where they were on different skills, I would adjust those groupings. You also can use anecdotal observations from the class or from different activities that you complete together. Another way to kind of mix it up and kind of add to that variety and also keep the students engaged and buying in the grouping process is to include student choice. An example of that is saying maybe you have two different grammar concepts that you're covering. And you could say if you want to work on possessive nouns, then you can come to this group. Or if you want to work on a contractions, you can come to this group today. So allowing them a little bit of autonomy in what they'd like to work on can also be helpful. The demonstration that I'm going to do today is a warm-up task. So you can also come into class and know what your content is going to be and know what the students are going to be working on, but you can use the performance of the students or their understanding of a specific question to help you figure out the grouping for that day. So an example of this is on this Jamboard right here. And I can post this in the chat, but I'm going to ask that everyone please navigate to the Jamboard. And then the very first slide will give you some directions. So I'm starting to see some people join. The limit is 20 people or 20 slides, and I've already used 18 of them for the first couple of slides. So I apologize if not everyone is able to join, but you will get the idea by watching and kind of observing what happens. So, and I believe even if you're not able to comment on your own specific slide, you will still be able to navigate and get a feel for the student experience. So the directions are to find a slide with a blank Post-it note. Once you find the slide, please type your name in the Post-it note in the corner. And then I'm going to ask you to answer the question that is on the slide. So there's a little catch to it. If you were born on an even day of the month, please get the question wrong purposefully. Okay, so this is just kind of to play in to show how I would do the grouping. Okay. So for an example, if I were to go to a slide, I would find one that had a blank Post-it note in the corner. And please, if somebody else's name is already written there, try to keep clicking to find another slide. I would click on the corner and I would edit it and I would type my name in the Post-it note. And then I would go ahead and I would complete the question. So just a little background. I noticed this might be helpful to provide a number of blanks for you to complete this. So there is a mystery number. It has 5 digits and it's separated by a decimal point in between the 3rd and 4th digit. So again, please find a Post-it note that's blank, type your name in it, and try to solve the mystery number by using the clues below. Okay, and if possible, if each person could find their own slide, that would be helpful. Okay, so I see people starting to type in. I'm going to give about 2 more minutes for people to start typing their answer next to the answer space. So once you've typed your name, go ahead and click in this text box. And to edit, you can click the 3 dots and click edit, and then you should be able to type your answer in. Okay. So again, you're going to have 3 whole number place values followed by a decimal point and 2 decimal place values. While people are working on that, I am going to navigate back to the slideshow and we will revisit this in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so if you're still working on the Jamboard, please feel free to finish that up. And then we're going to revisit it and show how I might use that to identify my group members. So once I know who's in my groups, and that could be decided before class or during class in the case that I was using a warm-up task, I would also want to identify the content that I wanted to teach. So there's several ways of doing that. You can use assessment data, either from standardized tests or from in-person assessments, in-class assessments. You can use high priority content. So if you use the high impact indicators or something that you've noted as a priority in your program, you could use that content. If you have a structured curriculum, for example, we use the future curriculum that is sequenced. You could use something like that to determine what you would teach. You could ask for student goals and design instruction based around student goals. You could use writing samples, anecdotal observations, or class assignments and discussions. So after I had those things kind of figured out, I would think about how I wanted to communicate that structure to the students. And I've been using a chart like this. It seems very simple, but it's really helpful in helping the students visualize what they're supposed to be doing and when. So I would either in a slideshow or on a whiteboard, I would create an array of 3 rows by 3 columns. And in the first column would be the groups that were assigned. So I would type the student names next to the group that they're in. And I just used group 1 and group 2, but you can get creative, have students pick names, whatever you wanted to do in your classroom. And then I would have the middle column would be for what they were doing first. And then the third column would be for what they were doing second. In each section, I would have, you can see, so for the first rotation, group 1 is meeting in group. I would tell them where we were meeting. So if it was in person, it might be at the back table. If it is online, you might say we're meeting in breakout room 1 or in the main room of the group meeting. You can do either breakout rooms or in the main room. I've done both and it seems to work out. What they're going to be doing. So you want to be kind of specific, tell them what you're going to be working on. For independent work, I would say where it was located. So if you have a learning management system, such as Google Classroom or Canvas, you could say that it would be located there. And then I would usually also include the title of the assignment. Same thing for group 2, but they would be reversed. Okay, so this is an example of what it would look like if I'd used it for an actual class. So you can see the same structure, but I've also included times, and then I've included what they're going to be working with along with page numbers or any resources that we were using. You can see for independent work, which you want to be explicit and tell them what any abbreviations stand for in the beginning, but you can specify what they're going to be working on. And also I like to include an early finisher activity if anybody finishes early. Okay. So here's an example of a variation. If you were using this in class, you might want to just create a chart that stays up in the class. This is just with painter's tape, but it's the same general framework, and you can just erase it, what you need to erase at the end of each class, and then substitute any different information. You could also use a pocket chart, which can be helpful because if you have index cards, you can quickly and easily shuffle around group names. You can use color coding. If students need to bring specific materials with them, you could add that to the chart. And you can also vary the number of rotations and the number of groups that you're meeting with. I've done up to 3 rotations and 3 different groups, but just keep in mind that the management gets a little bit trickier as you increase the number of groups and rotations. So just something I would suggest starting with less groups and building as your students got more comfortable with it. Okay, so going back to the Jamboard, what I would do next, and this could either be in person or online, once the students answered the question, I would just take a quick minute or 2 to go through, and I would identify what grouping they would be in. So if students did one name per slide, you could do that, but you can also see in this case, we have students, more than 1 student on a slide. So the correct answer for everyone is 842 7/100. So if you would go through and kind of see what the students answered, and then you can just create a quick Post-it note to assign them a group based on that. let's move on to another slide. Hopefully I get. All right, I'm going to go ahead and look for somebody who got this wrong. Hopefully somebody with an even number birth date. Okay. So for the purposes of this, we said if you have an even number birth date, then please get it wrong to kind of show how you would split your students up into groups. So going back to the how I would present that group to the students is you can just have a color-coded chart that kind of uses their current level of knowledge and shows them how they what group they would be in based on their answer to the warm-up question. Okay. Some adaptations within online or in person. For online, you can use different breakout rooms. I would suggest frequent check-ins with your students. A lot of times I would say, okay, we're going to check in at 8:25. And then at 8:25, I would say, if you're with me, please type, I'm here in the chat box. So I could keep tabs on where everyone was. Always provide those end or check-in times, just so that you're not going for too long with students kind of being independent and having questions. Another thing that's really important is having accountability. So Google Classroom does this automatically. You can check in and you can see, even if a student doesn't submit, you can see what answers they've typed in or where they are in an assignment. If you have an online learning system, maybe Essential Education or I know there's a lot of different ones that people have. A lot of those programs allow you to check in and see if a student has logged in at a certain time. But you do want to make sure, if you're teaching online, that you're able to check and see if the student is completing work during those independent pieces. And if they're not, you can just send them a quick email or check in with them and say, oh, I noticed that you weren't able to get to this. Can you tell me a little bit more about what problems you experienced? So you can help them and let them know that the completion is an expectation, but you're there to help if they need anything. Since you're going to be working with another group, you also want to provide avenues for students to ask questions and get answers. So that could be something like a Jamboard or a place where they could post a question and perhaps another classmate could answer if they know the answer. Or you could check in every once in a while and answer those questions and kind of develop a record of frequently asked questions so you know where students might get a little confused in the process. If you are in person, you could have a display that doesn't need to be changed. For example, if you have the whiteboard, that can be really helpful because that you don't have to erase that. Whereas if you're using a projector, sometimes you might want to use it for one of your group instruction periods. So just having that constant visual, or if you're online, you could post it on a learning management system. That's going to help them to know where they're supposed to be and when. If you're in person, you kind of want to monitor class activity and see how it's going. Independent work can present a great opportunity for collaboration. So you can, just because it says independent, doesn't necessarily mean they have to be doing it completely by themselves. That could be partner work, or there could be a student that they can go to for questions. Okay, and again, just providing opportunities for students to get their questions answered is going to develop that independence. 5 quick tips to get started. Start small. I would suggest 10 to 15 minutes at the end of class. Doing a simple activity is going to help. And then as you build the routine, you can make your tasks a little bit more complex. Have a home base. For me, I used Google Classroom, and that was the place where I posted these assignments. But you could also use a Wakelet, which is more web-based. There's another website called Symbaloo, which allows you to post specific images or ways for students to access certain websites. Or if you're in person, it could be as simple as a milk crate or a bulletin board with where you would consistently keep the assignments that they would be working on. You want to model it very slowly and practice it to kind of build it into your routine. And it might seem like it takes a lot of time in the beginning, but it will really pay off if you take it step by step and make sure students have a solid understanding of the routine. Develop your early finisher toolbox. That could be games, that could be online practice websites, but it's helpful to just remember that not all students work at the same rate, and that it's likely that some students would need something else or an additional place to go if they do finish early. And then, just like we mentioned, check in on students and make sure that they're building in that accountability so that they're completing and practicing the assignments during independent work. This is my contact information. I do see a couple of quick questions in the chat, so I'm going to hop over there next. But if there's anything I don't get to or I accidentally miss, please feel free to email me with any and all questions, and I would happily answer those for you. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat. So some of the tools that I mentioned were Jamboard, Symbaloo, also Wakelet is another way to provide links to students to let them know what you'd like them to work on. Can Jamboard be shared within a Zoom or WebEx environment so that all students can participate and have their activity visible to the whole class? Our program uses Microsoft Teams, so I'm not super familiar with those platforms, but perhaps a student could share their screen to show their work, and then that would be fully visible. The other thing about Jamboard is that it is collaborative, so that if you assign each student a slide, you could say, okay, we're all going to go and look at slide 6, and let's talk about this together. And it is shared just with a link. You do have to change the setting to make sure that every student has editing permission if you'd like them to edit it. But we've personally found that anything that we can share with a link rather than asking students to navigate to a learning management system has been successful for us pretty much across the board in our ABE and even our lower level ESOL classes. Okay, thank you. I see some people answering that for me. I appreciate that. Any other questions?
Well, Shauna, thank you so much.